Thank you very much, Sev. You're really too kind. That was very kind of you. A delightful introduction. Can I also pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation? This afternoon, in this short panel discussion, we're going to be looking at globalising law schools. Law schools are now much more than places to train practitioners to write wills for local law officers. They're broad educational institutions to train lawyers to do all aspects of work right up till the middle of this century and beyond. We have two dynamic deans on the panel. Both are quite dynamic, both are entrepreneurial, and both are very well known in the media. Seb spoke about Professor Williams. I was trolling the internet myself and saw a whole series of YouTubes involving Colin. I'm now going to ask each of them to give us 5 to 7 minutes of their background and their thoughts on internationalisation of law schools. Then I'll have a couple of questions and then we'll throw it open to the audience. So Professor Picker, would you like to lead off, please?
Sure, thank you very much. First, I'd like to say what an honour it is to be here, to have this chance to take part in what is an absolutely amazing initiative, and one that I hope over the next few years that I will continue to be as involved in as today. So, globalisation of Australian law schools. Well, the first thing I would say is I actually think that they are tremendously globalised already. Indeed, if you compare our law schools in Australia to the law schools in other countries, we are perhaps as globalized or more globalized than those law schools there. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't more to do. There certainly is. But let me explain how it is that I think that we are so globalized. And I think this is true for the GO8 and the non-GO8, the regional and the urban law schools. And this is based upon my experience interacting with deans and law schools around Australia over the last 9 years. How is it that we're so globalized? Well, first of all, if you look at the academic staff, you'll notice that almost all of the law schools have a high percentage of academic staff who are from overseas. And then if you look at the domestic origin ones, a huge number of those have studied overseas. So amongst the academics, teaching and researching, there's a great deal of knowledge of outside Australia and of international and transnational. Now, our students, if you visited any of the law schools in the last few years, you will see how diverse our student body is, including from first generation Australian students from varied backgrounds to international students who come over to get their master's, their JD, or their LLB. And then the content. More and more it is the case that our curricula include mandatory international, foreign, comparative offerings. So we're out there, we're doing that, we're engaged, we're involved in the networks around the world, and in some respects we are the leaders, I would say, in legal education in the world. But that's perhaps not enough. Australia in particular needs to be engaged, and we can't rest on our laurels that we're doing a great job when there's so much more to be done. And the one area I suppose that I can highlight right now, and in questions I'm sure I'll respond to other ones, is that we need to take a modern approach to globalization. So we need to break the shackles of what was the view of globalization. So for example, and this may come as, some of you may disagree, public international law used to be viewed as that's the way we show our adherence to international. I don't think that that's the case. Those of us in the field know public international is practiced so just mainly by governments, occasionally by the lucky practitioner. It's more transnational litigation, international economic law, private international law. It's those things which are the future and the heart of the content of the globalization that we need to be imparting to our students. And we need to encourage the move towards this modern view of globalization. With that, let me stop and turn it over to George.
Sure. Thanks very much, and it is a pleasure to be here. Welcome also to colleagues from other law schools and people from the community who've come to join in the conversation today. What I thought I'd do is perhaps share a little bit of our journey and to give you a sense of how it relates to really the topic that we're discussing today. I come from a law school, UNSW Law, which is about 50 years old, and Our law school is based upon the idea that we're training lawyers who will often be powerful people in the community. Sometimes they'll be politicians, sometimes they'll be judges, or sometimes they'll be powerful because they're the person you speak to when perhaps you've got a family law dispute. They might be the person who affects whether you get access to your children. There's all sorts of ways that lawyers play a key role in our society, and most importantly play a role in making sure we have a just and harmonious society. And lawyers, if you like, are the price we pay to live in a civilised, happy society, that we resolve disputes fairly and properly. So our law school is based upon that idea that lawyers are about serving the community, that power that lawyers exercise must be harnessed in a way that is for the community good. It can't be for just self-serving purposes. It can't be just for corporate profits. There's got to be a purpose that actually serves the nation as a whole. So when we were founded 50 years ago, our first dean, Hal Wootton, did so with the idea that our law school had to be infused with the idea of social justice. That when we teach our lawyers, they need to understand not just how the law can be used by rich and privileged people, but indeed how the law would be looked at from the perspective of someone upon whom the law bears harshly. So it might be disadvantaged, powerless people, it might be refugees is a key group. Or a special group that when we were founded had particular prominence were Aboriginal peoples, and our law school helped to set up the Aboriginal Legal Service and a range of institutions that are still here today. And over our history, we've had many, many Aboriginal graduates. This year we're just about to celebrate our 100th Indigenous student, which is a very big achievement and well ahead of where other law schools are because we've invested so heavily in training those students. So we come from a background of recognising that we have a mission. We've got a role. It's about education and research, but it's to a point. It's to have an impact, to make the community a happier and better place. So I come to this debate then of globalisation and what law schools can do, really in thinking about what we've done over more recent years to move out from that territory of wanting to make a difference in Australia. And for us it's been a big change where we've really focused on the international. We've said there's much more that Australia can contribute around the world, and there's much more that we must and should do in training these lawyers to travel and work anywhere in the world. And that includes across any of the continents, though of course Antarctica is a hard nut to crack, I would say, but any of the continents are where we would like to see our students making a difference. So when we look at how we do that, diversity really is the key for us in much of this internationalisation. We see diversity as an enormous strength. The different perspectives, the way of looking at the world is absolutely what we need. And partly over many years it was diversity in gender. And we came from a profession where men for many years have dominated the top positions in law from the High Court down. But that's something now where we have a majority of our professors are now female. It mirrors the fact that 60% of all of our law students are female. We've also looked at diversity in other aspects as well, recognising that really diversity needs to have many different aspects. But the diversity that's been of most importance to this particular discussion is cultural diversity. And there we recognise that you can't be a good global law school unless you're actually building into your curriculum perspectives that understand at a cultural level different backgrounds, religions, ways of life, and that needs to be done in a couple of ways. One is through staff. As Colin has said, law schools around Australia have done much in terms of recruiting the best talent from around the world. And this is where Australia has an enormous advantage over many other law schools. People want to live in Australia. People in particular would like to live in Sydney. And it's expensive, but it's a great and safe and wonderful environment to be. So we, as with other law schools, have really opened our doors to say we want the best talent from around the world, and that talent has come. For us, it's often been from China. That's one of the biggest sources of cultural diversity for us. And we now have 5 academics who speak Chinese, are from China. In fact, we have the largest number of Chinese academics in any law school in the world outside of China. But beyond that, of course, whether it be South America, whether it be in Europe, North America, there's been a very conscious desire to seek diversity in the classroom, which indeed is matching what we're seeing in our students as well. You've probably read in newspapers about the enormous explosion of international students that have come to Australia. It's really quite remarkable just how much that has happened over recent years. It's to the extent now that just a few months ago, Australia overtook the United Kingdom as having the greatest number of international students of any country in the world after the United States. So we're a pretty small country in terms of population, but we have now more international students from around the world than does the United Kingdom, and indeed any other country in the world, bar the United States. And that's such an enormous source of strength for us as a university sector and as a nation, that we are attracting those really talented students. And so our goal as a law school is to educate, to help build a sense of their responsibility, as I said, to serve the community, to work wherever they work, but not to forget that lawyers have this powerful, privileged role within society to really make society a better place. So I'll leave it there.
All right. Thank you to you both. Professor Picker, if I can ask you to follow on. You were born in Scotland, spent your teenage years there, you moved to the United States. You've worked in the United States, you've studied at Yale, you've come to Australia, you did a doctorate here, you've worked in China, very well travelled, very thoughtful person. I'm wondering if you could give us an idea. One doesn't want all law schools to be the same. What do you see as the characteristics of a young and emerging, vibrant law school like the University of Wollongong, where it sits? And can I also ask you about one of the issues in modern law, religion and law? When I started in law school, no one thought much about religion in this country in the 60s. Now it's become an issue of freedom of religion, freedom of speech. And what about families of law? I know at Sydney we teach Islamic law. Is there a role to teach students about Islamic law, other systems of law, civil law? Perhaps I'll let you take over from there, Professor Picker, and then we can follow on with George.
Yes, so your reference to my background really would support why I ended up as a comparativist. So I've lived across different systems. It was only natural that one of my areas of study would be to look at the different legal systems. And indeed, even when I was at law school, one of the ones I studied was Islamic law, which I loved as a subject. The only problem is I felt one semester was very much insufficient to cover what I really felt we need to learn. For a young law school like, say, the University of Wollongong, which is also a regional law school, though we are now also in southwest Sydney, globalization represents a different challenge, or different challenges than some of what George alluded to. So for example, the diverse background, the cultural backgrounds would be different when you're drawing from the regions than when you're drawing from, say, Sydney. That being said, because we've now moved into southwest Sydney, we now have a campus in Liverpool, and we're now in our second year of law, that's forced us to confront a whole new demographic, including, interestingly, a very large Muslim community from western and southwestern Sydney. And that's made us think of all sorts of interesting questions and different approaches that we have to think about. So just the other day, as we were scheduling our first year classes with this very large influx of students that we've now had, I said, have any of the students asked not to study on Friday? And we don't know, we hadn't heard back, but it's something that we're going to think about for the future. And certainly all of the food that we have at Southwest Sydney at our campus in Liverpool is halal, always, because otherwise it would just, that would exclude a major part of the community, and we must be inclusive. So we're actually facing a lot of the challenges that perhaps Sydney and UNSW faced a long time ago, but because we're now entering an urban environment, it's new for us. And so we're learning, we're responding. It's an exceptionally exciting time. I can say that the academics who've gone up to teach at Liverpool, who are used to teaching in Wollongong, have just loved it. They love the diversity of the students. So for the teachers, the academics, the professors, for them it's an incredibly enriching experience. And so I've had no problem at all having my academics go teach in a new, what is thought to be for some distant location. It's just been an absolute success. And I'll stop there because of time and let George continue.
Sure, and look, my background is not as exotic. I do come from Tasmania, if that counts. That's probably as exotic as you get. Probably as exotic as you get in Australia, I suspect. When I think about Ron's question, I think about, well, what is it that we really need to produce good lawyers in Australia? And often what people focus on is knowledge. Lawyers are meant to know things in books. They're meant to mend cases and things like that. But actually the best lawyers, that's not what they do. They've got the knowledge, but the really best lawyers are the ones who have empathy. They understand people. And that's probably the most important skill, I think, that a lawyer has. They can actually understand a client's problems. They can understand what that person is seeking to do. They can understand how a judge might decide a case. They can understand the broader currents in society that are affecting the way the law is developing and the way the community sees different issues. So for me, a really great lawyer is someone who is really attuned to the sort of society we have. That is, of course, a multicultural society. So for me, a great lawyer means understanding the great religions of the world. It means understanding different cultural and other traditional ways of looking at our society. And so again, for me, it's a no-brainer that if you want to produce great lawyers, you need lawyers in classrooms with people with many different backgrounds and experiences. You need lawyers exposed to different languages, different customs. And if you do that, then perhaps we'll start to produce the sort of people that we need for these roles.
Well, thank you both. Professor Picker reminded me of my first lecture at the University of Sydney. I came from Monash University in Melbourne, which was very much, and probably still is, a Jewish law school. And I was lecturing in the law of evidence, and I turned to class and I said, well, next Tuesday's Passover, we won't be meeting. A student put up his hand and said, what's Passover? And I thought, oh, this is different terrain. That was a long time ago, nearly 30 years ago. And I think law schools have become a lot more dynamic. Now, one of the things that globalised law schools do is they get involved in significant exchanges of students and staff, and particularly students, and perhaps I'm wondering if you could both tell me a little bit about your exchange programs and whether you think they're important. I hope you think they're important, both of students and staff. And Professor Picker, perhaps. I'm always leaning upon you to go first, but you're an able person.
And I'm happy to go first and let George, my former boss, have a few moments to collect his thoughts. It's interesting. A lot of the experience I draw on actually was experience that I got at UNSW with George's tremendous support, and Lucas, who's in the audience as well. We did a lot of work on international student mobility. Traditionally, we think of mobility as exchange, but the problem with exchange is that it can be quite expensive for students. It's quite disruptive. And if we were to leave the law school environment and go into, say, the STEM subjects, a lot of those students really aren't able because of their curricular demands. So we've started looking, and I know UNSW does this heavily, at short programs where we seek to enable students to go for 2, 3, 4 weeks overseas to experience different cultures, to mix with different students. And it's really, I think, a tremendously successful way for the students to have an effective and yet efficient international experience, which is so vital for their future careers and their ability to serve.
And let me start by acknowledging Colin, who is the guru in this area. And in fact, the many things we now do in this area, really Colin started many of these. And we're at the point now when over 1 in 2 of all of our students spend part of their degree overseas. And we're really pleased with that. We'd like to increase that. But that's the sort of degree we've got, that we think that if you want to be a lawyer, you should spend some part of your time overseas. It might be a short course, it might be exchange for 6 months, it might be a year. And the sort of places we send students to, that includes Shanghai or Beijing, which are two of the more popular schools that we have. Or beyond that, it might be Vanuatu, it might be Pune in India, it might be Zurich, it might be Santiago, it might be California, it might be New York. There's probably a couple I can't even remember. Lucas, I'm not sure, you would know, but that about covers it. But that's a smorgasbord, but they're the places that our students, I mean, they are so privileged and fortunate, but they start their degree and they have all of these list of places, and where would you like to go? Where would you like to spend some time? And the 2 weeks or so they spend in these places is both about getting an education, but also about cultural immersion. And it's really interesting, and this builds upon some of Colin's work, just how much benefit a person can get from 2 weeks in a place. You don't need to spend 6 months to get a benefit. 2 weeks meeting students from another law school, understanding a bit about their culture, visiting their city, meeting some of their teachers can be one of the most powerful experiences someone has in 3 or 5 years with us. in terms of just opening their eyes to how the world really works and how people do law and business elsewhere. So that's our goal, I suppose, that we want all of our students ultimately to have that sort of experience, because again, they will be better people and better lawyers, we think, as a result.
Thank you both very much. I'd now like to turn, well, first of all, let me say that I'm standing in for Professor Mary Crock, who is a member of the Affinity Board and usually does the terrifying questioning of deans. Given that I'm married to her, she said, "I'm busy, but you'll do today." And I said, "Okay." I want to talk about access and diversity. I'm going to start with you, Professor Williams. UNSW is a leader in Indigenous education for law students. Like most law schools, you have majority of women. I think at Sydney it's about 60% as well. What sort of things can law schools do to encourage women in the legal profession after they graduate? What sort of programs? What sort of things can law schools do to encourage diversity, not just of women, but of minorities, getting into law school and getting into the legal careers? And Colin, I began law at what was then called an access school for people who didn't have an opportunity to get to, shall I say, the old mainstream law schools. I'd like to hear a little bit about an international law school like Wollongong, what you're doing about accessibility. And I'll let your old boss go first, if that's okay. Professor Williams.
Thank you. Thanks, Ron. And we've been very fortunate that UNSW is seen as a successful law school, that we're a place that students want to come to, but that also causes us problems. To such an extent that a few years ago, our entry mark got to be 99.75 or something like that. It was so ridiculously high for the ATAR that to get into UNSW law, you needed to be privileged. You needed to go to a special, either state selective or private school. And we're essentially filtering out anyone who didn't have the most extraordinary opportunities in life. And we're actually at risk of really jeopardising our very mission, because if we started just replicating cycles of privilege in our society, training those people in particular whose parents were wealthy enough to send them to a private school, I mean, that would be the very antithesis of what we were trying to do. So what we did a few years ago is we said we need to change, and we've introduced a second test called the Law Admission Test, and we're the only law school in Australia that does this for undergraduate students. And so every one of our students, in addition to sitting the leaving certificate, they sit this second test, which is a problem-solving test. You can't study for it, and it's designed to really prioritise things like our good problem-solving skills, life experience. And what we've found is that it's really changed remarkably who admit into the degree. We now take students who might get an ATAR mark, not at 99.7, but at 90 or 92. We're admitting students from Western Sydney, particularly from rural and regional areas as well, where we're finding those students that may have gone to, let's say, Dubbo High. No student at Dubbo High gets 99.7. They don't have the opportunities, the schooling, the advantages. But a student who gets 92 or 93 and sits this other test, the odds are they're going to be a brilliant lawyer. And they're the student we want. So we've changed the way we admit those students to deliberately prioritise talent and to deprioritise privilege and what otherwise would be natural access into a degree. It's not perfect by any means, but it's making a real difference and is a real priority for us. For Indigenous students, for many years, we've got a special access scheme, winter, summer schools and the like, that take them from around the country. We give them pre-training so they can be admitted into law. That's how we've got to the 100 students, because again, they would not have got there in any large numbers. And when it comes to entering the profession, that's where we really prioritise our industry relationships and things like that, so that we provide a pathway through our careers service for our students. And ultimately, we think that the lawyers of our society should reflect the society they serve. And that's still very much a work in progress. It's not just Indigenous students. There's a larger issue of cultural diversity, I think, as well, that we need to tackle. But that's what we are committed to tackling. So we think as a public institution committed to community good, well, that diversity angle through entry, through exit and everything is just critical to us being true to the values we hold.
So I'll just talk about 3 initiatives that we pursue in order to improve access and diversity. The first is that we have an early admissions interview process for admission into our undergraduate law program. And about 2/3 of our students are admitted before they do the HSC on an unconditional offer based upon their record, based upon references, and based upon interviews. And I can tell you those interviews we do during the school break. My colleagues drives them mad because they have little kids, but they have to come in during that time, and we interview 500, 600 applicants. This results in an incredibly diverse body. There was concern for a while amongst some of my colleagues that this meant we were letting in students who were not as good as the high ATAR achieving students, because we also have a ridiculously high ATAR in my opinion. So I did a study of what their WAM, their GPA was at the end of the first year based on the 2016, and on average our early admission students performed 1 point higher than our ATAR admission students. So that was a strong sign that what we were doing certainly wasn't wrong and was probably right, and certainly as good as ATAR as an indicator of success. So that's one way that we do that. The other is going into Southwest Sydney. Southwest Sydney allows us to offer our, what I would say, world-class teaching in law to students who otherwise would have to travel very far in order to get just as high quality teaching. So with the, you all know the traffic. The traffic to drive in from the western suburbs and southwestern suburbs is just terrible. It could be an hour and a half, 2 hours, 2.5 hours to get to UTS or to Sydney or to UNSW. And we're now offering this access locally within the Southwest Sydney area. I'm doing this, alongside Western Sydney, and we're thrilled to be working in the same area as them. I hope they're as thrilled as we are to be providing, more access to more students. And the third way that we're providing access is something which I've specifically started this year, which is a formal part-time program. And the part-time program is both for our graduate LLB, so older students, and also our direct entry and our double degrees. And we've set up seminar classes in such a way that if you are looking after, you have dependent responsibilities, you can study in the middle of the day, or if you have jobs that you must be at, you can study early or late. And we've set up a part-time progression. And this is allowing members of the community who otherwise would not have been able to go study in a high-quality law program the opportunity to do so. And we're making this available at all of our campuses. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you both.